presentation for anyone who isn't able to make it. So just know that that recording will be coming if you'd like to share it with anyone who wasn't able to join us today. And if there are people who are still joining us right now, that's fine. We're just going to get into some introductions and things, so we'll be able to catch everyone up here with no problem. So my name is Ashley Quick. I am a subject matter expert with PCG and Project Success, which I've been doing for 3 years now. Before that, I was a special ed teacher for about 10 years, and I had what I call a gap year or 2 or 3 in between where I did some project management work for a textbook publisher. But we on the Project Success team enjoy showing off our families in our presentations. Makes our work just a little bit more joyful to get a peek of our families during the day. So that's my husband, Tony, and my daughter, Aaliyah, and my son, Jackson.
Good afternoon. My name is Heidi Brett Baker. I, too, am a part of the Project Success team. I've been with PCG, Public Consulting Group, for a little over 2 years now. Previously, before I joined the team, I've had lots of experience. I'm definitely the senior on the team. This is my 34th year as an educator. I taught for many years in the classroom, and then I moved into school administration, and then went on to higher ed, and then worked here as a consultant. I too have pictures here to show. I have 8 children, so I don't have all my children on the screen, but I do have 5 beautiful grandchildren, and these are my grandchildren and my husband on the screen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Meredith Keating Merck, and I'm the Director of Project Success. Those are my kiddos. We'll start with the important stuff. Those are my kiddos, Carlisle and Lennon. Prior to Project Success, I was a special education teacher for 8 years, both in Indiana and Florida, a building level administrator for 3 years, both as a dean of students and a special education coordinator. And I'm starting my 6th year here with the Project Success team working for a public consulting group. I am so glad you are all able to join and follow along today as we talk about the content connectors.
All right, and here is just a slide showing all the people on our team. So you've heard from Meredith and Ashley and myself, and Amy Howie is also on our team. And then we have 2 project managers that help support it, and those are all the wonderful people who you get all your emails from for registration and to log in. That is Mary and Christine. So we're happy that they're on our team and joining us today as well. So this is our slide that really talks about that we are definitely part of the Indiana Resource Network. That resource is a large group of resource centers that each have a unique niche that we are all either partially or fully funded by the Department of Education. Each one of us support all the local school districts in Indiana. You can click, oops, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. It flipped over for me. I apologize. So this slide just shows our stats for Project Success. It shows all the things that we have to offer as Project Success. We do many webinars, obviously now during our crazy virtual time. In those webinars, we talk about unpacking the content connectors, curriculum mapping, goal writing, helping you support you through this distance learning journey. Really think about the many different topics we're talking about in different summer institutes. This summer we covered inclusive practices. We have many webinars that are on our website, or we do live that you'll be able to watch the recordings later. We also have, we want to show you on here that we have 10 model sites. So we work with 10 sites specifically to really help hone in on their practices so that we can spread that around the state. So that's what this slide tells us, all the stats that are on there. There we go. Now I'm on the right slide here. I apologize a minute ago, but this is the Indiana Research Network slide where it talks about all the many resource centers that have a unique specialty area that are supporting the school districts in Indiana. Most of our resource centers are either fully funded by the Department of Education or partially. Each one of these is a live link, so you can click on the slide and it will take you right to those website so that you can know a little bit more about those resource centers. Well, we're excited to announce that we have had a revision to our website. And so when you are logging into our website, we want you to make sure that you add the word Indiana to the end of Project Success. Otherwise, you might perhaps find a different website because there's a couple other Project Success websites out there. When you are logging on, you want to find that resource tab. And in that resource tab now, we have it listed under how you might find all the many documents and templates that we have. You can find educator resources, administrator resources, resource by the district, or distance learning resources. We know those distance learning resources are so popular right now because many of us are either working virtually or on a hybrid platform. So we've put all those on there so they're more readily available and easy to find for you. So if you did click on the educator section for resources, these are some of the things that you might find. You're certainly going to find quick access to the content connectors. If you've been on any of our content connector webinars or been in any face-to-face trainings, we talk a lot about all the resources and the tools. And so they are listed right here, and I'm sure they'll be highlighted throughout today in our session. But that vertical alignment and the blueprints are right there. If you're looking for transition supports, there's a whole section on transition supports. We spent a lot of time working on like choice boards and some activities during the virtual learning webinar this past spring. So those are listed on there. If you're looking for some help with some videos or some resources to help you with just different instructional strategies and resources, go under instructional resources and click on that, and there'll be a drop down and it'll list many different strategies that you can find, and it's great access here to be able to find it. Then if you would go back into that again, that resources, and you click on the administrator resources, this is what we pull up, some of these things. And there's some great things on there for administrators. If whether you're a brand new administrator to special education or you've been an administrator for a while, you want to be helping those new teachers. And this would help them looking at goal writing templates. It helps you find some blogs that are out there that we've created this past spring. Also gives you all that distance learning supported documents, because we know that each district is unique. We know each district is doing a different thing for their virtual platform or their virtual learning. And so we want to just help you and give you the resources and the tools that we've created to really support your teachers. So these are all listed right there. So for today, if you went under Project Success Indiana and you went to that top right-hand corner again, you want to just switch over one tab to the Events tab. And if you click on that and then you scroll down, you're going to find where it says Conferences and Presentations. Our webinar today is found under this 2020 Back to School webinar. And you just click go on there and you'll find it. And everything then is on our website for today for this presentation. So for today, let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we certainly have started with some introductions, and we are going to just kind of continue through letting you know about what Project Success is all about and what we do. Then we're going to dig into what are the 5 W's of the content connectors: the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. And those are for the people who are brand new to us and brand new to the content connectors. Then we know some of you are on here who have maybe heard a little bit about content connectors before, know kind of the basics, but we kind of want to move on to the next step. So for those of you, then we're going to really focus in on the how. We're going to talk about the tools and the resources that are necessary when really implementing content connectors, kind of moving to the stage of application, and then how to share those with your gen ed teachers, your paras, and your families. And then last, we're going to follow up with some questions and highlight all the new upcoming training opportunities for you or for some of your support staff. So what we'd like to accomplish today, we'd love for by the finish of our webinar today, that we will have described the 5 W's of the content connectors, and you guys will understand those 5 W's. We want to help you explore ways to share and implement content connectors across the many different stakeholders in your building. And then we want to identify the high leverage practices that aligned and implement the content connectors for your students. Well, let's start out hearing from you a little bit. So tell us in the chat box, how familiar are you with content connectors? How comfortable are you with implementing content connectors in your instruction? Use the number scale from 1 to 5. How familiar are you and how comfortable are you? 1, not at all. 5, that you're completely content and you have lots of confidence in implementing the content connectors. Anybody willing to share with us for that? Thank you. There we go. So several of you are saying 3. Great. So that means you probably are familiar a little bit with content connectors, but you want to move to that next level. You want to start thinking about how are you going to implement those content connectors in your daily lesson plans and in your curriculum planning. Well, you're at the right spot if you're a 3, because for this webinar, because we're going to really go through those 5 W's, like I said, and we are going to highlight the how. How do you move from a 3 to a 4? How do you move from a 2 to a 3? And it's okay if you're at that level too, because this certainly is an intro at the beginning to really content connectors and who they're for, and all the W's of content connectors. Thank you for those who have shared. All right, well, let's move right into Content Connectors 101. Let's talk about those 5 W's. And we're going to start off with the who. So who are the content connectors for? They are for students with significant intellectual disabilities. When we talk about that, we are talking about specifically the students who are in that 1%. We are not talking about students who are struggling in the curriculum, but we are talking about the students who are taking alternate assessment, who are definitely have to have the Indiana academic standards modified, who their whole entire curriculum is modified. These are the students that we're talking about. They are the students who are in the high school level on a certificate of completion, and they are the students who, like I said, are taking an alternate assessment. So what does that 1% mean? This visual kind of really drives home to what that 1% should look like in your school district. The green area, like we see here, they're students with no identifiable disability. The blue is mild disabilities, and then that orange is that sliver is that 1% of students with significant disabilities. Those students, according to our U.S. Department of Education, should only be about 1% of your student population. That is what we talk about when you might have heard it before, the intent of the 1% rule. That is the rule that always that 1% we should be assured that they are the students that should be identified as students who are on the alternate assessment, who are participating in the alternate standards. The what? So what are the alternate standards? Well, all content connectors are aligned to the Indiana academic standards. They are not an easier version. They are a condensed version. And oftentimes, when you think about the content connectors, they align directly with the Indiana academic standards, but sometimes you might see for one standard, there's two content connectors because we're breaking it down. You can find the Indiana alternate standards here. We have them listed right here on our website and links to our website right here. You also can find them on the Indiana Department of Education website. It is clear that these are, when you're utilizing the content connectors, that they are aligned to the grade level of what the student is in, and they are aligned to the grade level of Indiana academic standards. It is also important to remember that the standard highlights knowledge and skills necessary for a student to hit that learning target at that grade level. Another key thing that is often misunderstood is that people believe that all content connectors are on the assessment. That's not true. What is true is that they're all important. We want to teach all the content connectors, but not all content connectors are on the alternate assessment. That is why we have the blueprint and we talk about priority standards. All right, here, if you've looked at the standards, here is a comparison. So on the left-hand side are the Indiana academic standards, and then on the right is the content connector. And like I said before, occasionally you will have one Indiana academic standard, and there'll be 3 content connectors that correlate with that Indiana academic standard. That standard is broken down into multiple content connectors. Okay. So tell me, that's just kind of the who and the what. What kind of questions you have so far? If you're totally new to content connectors and this is kind of the first time you're seeing some of the resources, do you have any questions so far about that? Does everybody know where to go to find the content connector if they want to find their grade level? There we go, Christine. So is there somewhere to download? Yes, you can go on our website has it, and so does the Indiana Department of Education. You're welcome.
And Christine, we will add that to the chat box here in just a minute so that you have a direct link there. I want to make sure you have that. I'll go on ahead. If there are other questions, we're going to continue to moderate the chat box throughout the session today. So continue to ask them there. Heidi or Ashley or anyone on the team can jump in and answer those questions directly there and send some links. So thank you, Heidi. I'm going to jump in with the when we should see the content connectors utilized. And this isn't a trick question. The short answer to this question is we should see them at all times across both instruction and our daily planning. So when we think about that, and an example as you're relating that back to your classroom is to really think about whether that your classroom currently is virtual or in person. And I know it may change by the day, but your students, coworkers, administrators should see those content connectors in action throughout your lesson. So making sure that you're utilizing those in your lesson plan development, starting with the content connector and designing all your instructional activities around that standard. And really thinking about how to engage your learners in the process. So making sure that the content connectors are utilized in daily instruction, making sure that development of IEP goals starts with a grade level content connector for each of your students. It's also essential to mention that the content connectors, and Heidi alluded to it, that the content connectors are on the IM assessment. So that's just one reason among many that we utilize those content connectors in instruction. We don't want to solely focus on an assessment as our guidance for the content connectors because we know they're essential in all elements, instruction, our day-to-day planning, and then assessment, of course, to know where our students are growing both formatively and summatively as well. So there are 4 links here, and we will not go in depth on the IEP process or lesson planning, but we wanted you to have those tools. So the first link you're going to see is just our lesson plan template. It'll walk you through, there's a screenshot there. It starts with a lesson objective It lets you align the Indiana academic standards and the content connectors there, and then it gives you the opportunity to break down that standard further. And we'll talk about this tool at the end as well, so we leave you with that. There's also a lesson plan webinar, and it aligns and walks you through this process in total so that you can follow along and learn about the importance of utilizing those content connectors from the start in your lesson plan. And then the last two links and the third link there, the IEP goal writing webinar, is probably our most popular webinar that we have. This was re-recorded in 2020, so it's been updated by our staff and walks you through the goal writing process, starting with a grade level content connector, unpacking, and making sure that it aligns to student present levels. And then last but not least, the IM blueprints, which is another version of the content connectors that break them down by priority. So if you're like me, you like to see which are the most important for and will be on the assessment so that you can prioritize those standards as you move forward, those content connectors. The next piece that we're going to look at, and it corresponds with the where as well, is we're going to talk about least restrictive environment. And it's important to remember that when we talk about the least restrictive environment, or LRE, it's not a place, and it's really that principle that guides student programming. It's revisited by the case conference team frequently. It's individualized for every student on their level of need, and it's consistently reviewed. It's not a place, it's that principle that guides us. So therefore, the content connectors are meant to be used inside the student's least restrictive environment. So that might be a self-contained classroom, it might be a general education classroom, or for many of our students, it's both. They're receiving services in a self-contained classroom for part of the day and in the general education for part of the day as well. So the least restrictive environment is where we implement the content connectors. So we know that we should be including students with significant intellectual disabilities within the general education setting to the maximum extent appropriate for that student. And so that doesn't mean when it's easiest for either the student or the teacher. It really goes to finding ways to make that general education setting accessible for the student and not about fitting students into programming that we currently have. It's about shaping that program and making it fit to meet the needs of each student individually. So again, the least restrictive environment is where we implement those content connectors. And I think this next quote really summarizes the least restrictive environment and kind of really puts into perspective the why of what we are doing. The least restrictive environment provision in IDEA is the same as that of Brown versus Board of Education. Separate but equal can never be equal. Therefore, students with disabilities have a right to equal access to general education settings, curriculum, and instruction as a matter of basic civil rights. And of course, there will always be circumstances in which a student's health or their safety or even their academics may require services and supports that go beyond that which can be provided in the general education setting. And that is completely understandable and individualized for every student that we work with. However, it is important before students are placed in a more restrictive environment, the LRE mandate requires that we have made that effort to keep the student in their least restrictive setting. So I just think it's important that we go back to that maximum extent appropriate versus convenient as we think about least restrictive environment. All right, so the next piece that we're gonna look at is more of going into the why. So having high expectations for students, and you're gonna hear Project Success talk high expectations all of the time. Because we know that for students with significant disabilities, it is so important to have those high expectations, but not unreasonable expectations. So it is really important to think through the statement, fair does not always mean equal. When we have our high expectations for students, any students, all students, we're making room for them to grow. Which if you look at the visual there, that's that red arrow, kind of looking at that student growth. And by keeping our expectations low, we are artificially stunting the growth that they may have otherwise. So we know that we have to establish those high expectations and really think about how we encourage students to grow through establishing those high expectations. And part of that comes from presuming competence. So if you met with Project Success either on site or any of our webinars, you know we talk about presuming competence because we know how essential it is for student growth. So when we discuss the idea of presumed competence, we like to share this analogy of the tree. It's easy to get caught up in thinking about what we see in students and how their growth might be that way. And when we look at a student, we like to use this analogy because oftentimes we can only see that in the similar to the trees, the trunk and the branches and the leaves. But when we look at the whole child, the roots are really the foundation to their learning. That's what brings the nourishment and the growth. And so without the roots, without that we can't see, that competence piece, students become stagnant, trees become stagnant. So it's so essential that we're nourishing what we can't see in students and making sure that we're setting those high expectations and making sure that those are reasonable expectations, but that's aligned to the content connectors in the process. We often get stuck on keywords, or we hear it as Project Success team members often, words like severe and profound, low IQ, and some of those artificial labels that get put on students. And so it's essential that we move beyond those labels and really think about how we can set the stage with high expectations, utilizing the standards and aligning that curriculum, and making it reasonable for those students, but still having that growth and that stretch for students as well. So I'm going to pass the mic to Ashley so that we can start to dig a little bit deeper into the content connectors today and continue to show you different resources along the way.
Okay, thanks, Meredith. So we covered our Content Connectors 101. We learned a little bit more about what they are, who they're for, when and where they should be found, and so forth. But now let's dig a little bit deeper into some of those resources that we mentioned earlier and ways that you can be sharing those resources with your colleagues and families of students. So let's look at the how. The how is really the big one. I think a lot of people can get on board with, okay, I get that there are alternate standards. I get what they're for, but how do I do it? Especially if you're not used to it, it can seem really overwhelming. So each of these elements here in these bubbles are ways that help you as an educator in implementing the content connectors. We'll talk about a few of them in more detail here during the remainder of this presentation. And the others that you see here, they'll give you good places to start exploring more on your own. Before we get started looking at the resource documents in more detail, I just wanted to note that the focus on instruction should be on the high priority content connectors. It was mentioned a couple times that not all content connectors show up on the assessment. And so we'll look at the documents here that help you identify which ones are high priority. It would be extremely difficult to cover all the content connectors in detail throughout the school year. So targeting the high priority ones ensures that students are exposed to the most critical content that serves as building blocks to their future knowledge and in the later grade levels. So we'll take a look at a couple of the reference documents here in just a minute that will show you how to identify which ones are the high priority. This one you just saw, the side-by-side version of the content connectors, but I wanted to point out a little bit more about it. So this one is useful for helping understand the alignment of the Indiana academic standards to the content connectors. It's essential to share these with the general education teachers. It really increases their understanding of what a student with a significant intellectual disability should be responsible for in a particular lesson, which content should be emphasized in a lesson for that student. Students with significant disabilities aren't responsible for learning all content within their grade level, but they do have the right to be exposed to that content and have it broken down in ways that make it more accessible to them. So what this document shows is for instance, this is third grade, while a third grade teacher may be focusing on the standards on the left side in their lessons, a student with a significant intellectual disability in that third grade classroom will be zoning in more so on the content in the right-hand column. That's the content that they really need to focus on. And if that is still too difficult, then we work on unpacking and breaking it down and making it more accessible. But they do still have the right to be exposed to that content. So here's the second reference document that we'll talk about, the vertical alignment. And what this version shows is how skills build on each other as students move through the grades. There are a couple different versions of this. The one we're looking at now is a K through 5, and then we also have a 6 through 8 version. This really shows the progression of a particular standard throughout those grade levels, so you can see how they build on one another. It's also really useful for teachers who have students from multiple grade levels in their classrooms. So if you identify sort of the basic skills and knowledge that are common throughout that standard, regardless of the grade level, then you can develop your lessons that touch on those key points from a range of grade levels, rather than having your, hold on, let me teach my first grade reading lesson, now my second grade reading lesson, now my third grade reading lesson. You can really look at those 3 standards across those grade levels, pick out the key elements, and design a lesson that covers them all. The color coding that you see on here comes from our last version of the reference documents that we'll look at here in just a second, indicating the priority of the content connectors. But just so you know, the vertical alignment documents show that color coding as well. So here's that description of the blueprint we've been mentioning. This is a modified version of the actual blueprint for the IEM assessment. And it shows there's a lot more information on the actual blueprint, but what we've narrowed it down to is to show the minimum and maximum potential times that an item could show up on the assessment for a student. So if it's likely for a content connector to show up at least one time, a minimum of one time, and it could be up to a maximum of 4. And this is based on, because the IEM is a stage adaptive test, some students will get more than others. Depending on how they perform on the earlier questions. But if it's guaranteed to be a minimum that content connector will show up on the assessment, that is really what deems a content connector to be high priority, because we know it's going to show up on the assessment. And then to determine which ones we consider to be more of that medium area, it could potentially not show up on the assessment depending on how the student performs with that stage adapted piece, but it also could show up a maximum of maybe 2 times. So that is definitely something we want to make sure we cover throughout the school year. And then that sort of that gray color, those are sort of the ones that, again, they are still important for instruction. It's important that they're exposed to the content, but it's less likely to show up in the assessment. It's less likely to be sort of a building block of knowledge and skills in future grades. And so we sort of have that closer to the bottom and really make sure that we're focusing on those purple and blue standards. One thing I wanted to point out through each of these 3 resource documents that we've been looking about, even though they're arranged differently and can be used for different things, you know, whether it's aligning to gen ed or whether it's looking to see how you can bring together several grade levels at once, regardless, the content connectors themselves are the same in each document. They're not, you know, multiple different content connectors running around. They're all the exact same content connectors. They're just arranged differently depending on what purpose you might be using that document for. We mentioned at the beginning that we would talk and kind of point out just where some of these high leverage practices come in. So here for the looking at the content connector resource documents, this is a high leverage practice that will really help teachers to systematically design their instruction toward a specific learning goal. So using those documents will help ensure that the instruction you're designing is specified for the students with more significant disabilities. You can really hone in on those content connectors and make sure that you're being specific and intentional to reaching the content that they need. So those are the 3 versions of the reference documents that we have for looking at the content connectors. And we just wanted to point out a few considerations for sharing those with colleagues. Sharing that side-by-side version of the content connectors, again, that's so, you know, general educators as well as paraprofessionals, they can see how that aligns to the Indiana academic standards. You know, where are these content connectors coming from, and why are we doing this? Because we need that alignment to the Indiana academic standards. You can think about sharing the project success lesson plan template, which we'll look at here later. Again, I think that's a really useful way for general educators to see how to incorporate content connector considerations into their lesson planning process. It's really very similar to many lesson plan templates, but there are specific sections that will help draw out considerations for those students with more significant needs. If you're emphasizing the goal of those high yet reasonable expectations, that's something you really want to share with your colleagues, especially those who may be a little more skeptical on these points. Having high expectations for our students with significant disabilities does not mean that those expectations are unreasonable. So we want to make sure we're really emphasizing that point, that we're holding them to high expectations, but we're also still being reasonable with what we're expecting. And then the last bullet point, my goodness, we could have multiple trainings just on this alone to consider how principles of universal design for learning could increase access for all. So something to think about when you're thinking about sharing with colleagues, and we can talk more about universal design for learning later and for days really, but those principles, they're not only for students with disabilities, they can increase access to learning for all students. And so if we find ways that implementing those principles of universal design for learning can assist our students with significant intellectual disabilities, it's important that we're sort of emphasizing with our colleagues, this could also help other students in the class. And it doesn't have to be sort of this special initiative. It can be, hey, let's make this a little bit easier for everyone to access the content or the lessons. So the high leverage practice that sort of aligns with that is obviously collaborating with professionals to increase student success. So when you're sharing these resource documents, with gen ed teachers, with the paraprofessionals, anyone else who may be coming into contact with students, that's really making sure that staff are working together to increase student outcomes. So we wanted to kind of stop here for a moment again and check in with you all. How do you envision, after all of this that you've been hearing about the content connectors, how do you envision utilizing those resources that we talked about to inform your teaching? And or what resources will you share with your colleagues, your general education colleagues, your paraprofessionals? What is standing out to you as a particular resource that you find helpful that you'll want to make sure you use to inform your teaching or that you'll want to share with your colleagues? Yes, Meredith said we'll pause just a moment to allow everyone to respond. I know sometimes it's hard to get those keyboard fingers woken up. Remember, we talked about those three different reference documents, and even though they are all the same content connectors, they can really support different purposes for your instruction and your planning and your collaborating with your colleagues. So if there's a particular area of your own teaching, or if you're an administrator, if you have some new teachers on your team and you're thinking there's really one particular area that they'll need support in, whether it's lesson planning, whether it's sort of working together with general educators, whether it's making sure you zone in on the high priority content connectors, there's a document for you. There's a document that will help support whatever that need is. So Mary is sharing, I put the content connectors on lesson plans and then share that with my paras. Excellent. Yeah, sharing really as much as you can with your paraprofessionals is key, because we know oftentimes they don't get as much training as they should to be supporting these students, and so anything you're able to share with them is great. Christina's sharing the side by side with gen ed teachers for the students who are pushed out, as well as the support staff. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough, honestly. Well, both sharing with general educators, but with paraprofessionals too, that we're not leaving them out of the equation. They do so much to support our students, and if we can inform that support as much as possible, we really can make sure that we're increasing outcomes for students in that way as well. If there's anyone else who wants to share, please take your time, put it in the chat box. We'll make sure that we get to it. But I know that we are um, quickly approaching the end of our time together, and I want to make sure we get to the rest of this important content. So we'll see how quickly I can get through this. Unpacking the content connectors, that was one of the bubbles on that sort of rainbow, those rainbow bubbles that we showed a minute ago. And it's really one of the key ways that we can implement academic standards and instruction for our students with the most significant disabilities. When we're talking about unpacking, What we mean is that we're truly breaking down the standards to find the access points for individual students. This is critical to make sure that they're exposed to the grade level content, but also making sure that they're working on skills that are closer to their current ability levels. And again, it goes back to that having high but reasonable expectations. We want to make sure that they're receiving that grade level content, but we also want to make sure that it's meaningful for them, that it's not just sort of sitting and and stewing in this information that makes no sense. We want to find ways to make it accessible and find those access points that they can latch onto. And unpacking is the way that we do that. So when we're unpacking, there are a few elements to focus on. We want to look at the skills that are being addressed, both directly related to the content connector, but also skills that are sort of embedded within that standard, such as communication. We're also going to look at the vocabulary that's involved in teaching that content connector, including related core vocabulary that can help students who are just now developing their language skills. We want to look at academic vocabulary terms that are more content specific and probably will be encountered again in future grade levels. And we also want to consider assessment vocabulary, so any terms that are specific to how questions might be asked on an assessment. We want to make sure that we're preparing our students to be ready for those terms as well. And then the last element to consider when unpacking is the functional application of what that content connector is asking. How might that skill or that knowledge appear in the student's life in the future? We'll look at each of these elements, these unpacking elements, briefly in the next few slides, but I wanted to point out that we also have another webinar coming up that will delve into this topic of unpacking more deeply, and I'll share details with you here in just a moment on how you can join that webinar. So this unpacking template is really the structure for walking you through all of those elements that I just discussed for unpacking an individual content connector. So you're going to list the specific content connector at the top, then you're going to identify the skills and the concepts that you find within that content connector. The skills are what the student should be able to do based on what that content connector is saying. And the concepts refer more to what the students should know, truly concepts that are found within that content connector. And then what I find to be the most important box is that access skills piece. What access skills are required for every student to master this grade level content connector? Um, that's really where we're going to see the pieces where it's broken down almost step by step. What do we need? What are the building blocks that will get up to that grade level content connector? What I want to make sure I point out here before we move on is the high leverage practice that aligns with this. So identifying and prioritizing long and short-term learning goals, that's exactly what Unpacking Content Connectors does. It's providing that meaningful access to and success in the gen ed curriculum. So you're using those grade level standards, but then you're breaking them down and really finding ways that you can set these long and short-term goals based on what you've broken down and the access points that you have found within Unpacking. I mentioned academic vocabulary being an important piece of unpacking. We have a couple links up there in the upper right-hand corner, but I also included just tiny little screenshots here to give you an idea of what we're talking about and what those documents look like. So academic vocabulary, it's important that we're intentional about using it and that we're intentional about teaching the academic vocabulary to students because it, it allows them to have linguistic accessibility, right? The verbal sort of the words, right? The um, access to the content with those words. These are the words that they hear their peers using in their different classes, and they should be aware of those words and those terms and be able to at least be familiar with them, recognize them if they do show up on the assessment, and so forth. Now, we wouldn't only stick to academic vocabulary. We want to make sure we're also using student-friendly language as well to explain these concepts. But it's important to bring along that academic vocabulary side by side so they can understand what's being taught, but also have experience with those terms. Another key piece here, when we're thinking about that functional application, that sort of that third element of the unpacking, how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to implement the content connectors when you've been focusing on functional skills for so long? And this may be new to you to be bringing in academics alongside. So it's really important to look at how you can sort of bring both of them together in different ways. So you might want to look at incorporating functional skills into just daily routines rather than devoting specific blocks of time to that. at the elementary level, if your students are working on something like shoe tying, you don't want to set aside 20 minutes a day to work on shoe tying. But if a student comes to you with an untied shoe, then you use sort of that natural opportunity to teach them shoe tying. The reverse is true as well. So if you have time set aside in your day for more functional skill types things like a social skills lesson or group, consider using academic content during those groups. So maybe you're having a conversation about a subject or a topic that is found within that academic content, but you're still working on those skills that are more related to social skills, like waiting your turn or commenting to a peer or things like that. And then lastly, make sure you're being intentional when you're thinking about, when you're unpacking the content connector, be really intentional about identifying how this might appear in the student's life moving forward. How might they actually use this? The example I give a lot is I was working with a high school teacher who just really didn't like the idea of teaching algebra to his students with more significant disabilities. He thought that was just bizarre and uncalled for. And he said to me, I really just want, when my students go bowling, I want them to be able to pay for their bowling game and know how much change they're supposed to get back. Like, this is what I want my students to know. And it was so funny that that happened to be just a perfect example of what he had been sort of fighting against, which was algebra, right? Finding an unknown. If your bowling game costs $6 and you pay with a $10 bill, you get $4 back, but that's an unknown that you have to find. And so that would be an example of the functional application of an algebra skill. We don't necessarily want our students to be walking around, completing algebra equations, pages and pages of them, but if they can apply that concept to their daily life and knowing how much change to get back, then that's much more useful. That's a much more useful skill for them. So that's just one example, but I think it's really important to have that in mind as you're thinking about other content connectors as well. How might this actually show up in my students' daily lives, and how can I sort of tweak things to make sure that I'm presenting it to them in that way? Long story short here about the balance piece really is just that a typical day for a student there should be a balance of instruction in academic skills and functional skills. The academics, if possible, should be balanced throughout the morning and afternoon just to give them time to process. And then also thinking about having a balance of time spent with the teacher, whether that's you or another primary teacher, but also the other support staff in the building. We don't want anyone to get too tied to any one person. We want to make sure that our students are able to work with a variety of staff. So in other words, students should be interacting with a variety of content and a variety of people throughout their school day, and that will really provide that balance that we're looking for. All right, I promised I'd give you some information on how to get to that Unpacking Content Connectors webinar. So that's going to be on Wednesday, September 16th from 3 to 4 p.m. There's a registration link here. If you access our PowerPoint from our website, you'll be able to click directly on that hyperlink, or I made it a bit.ly, so it's hopefully short enough that you can type it in, but that is the registration link for you to be able to join us then. And we'll review just a little bit about, again, who utilizes content connectors and where you can find them. But most importantly, we'll spend a good amount of time talking about how you can make the content connectors accessible to students. By looking at that unpacking template, we'll look at some examples and really think about how we can break that down to make the content accessible to students. All right, up next, we'll talk about how to collaborate to get these content connectors implemented.
Okay, thank you. I did see in the chat box there was a request for resources on curriculum aligned to content connectors. This is a slight sidebar, but we do have a list of curriculum that we have seen teachers utilizing to implement the content connectors across the state. So we can add that to the chat box, and then we'll share some additional ideas that will really align to what you mentioned there of looking at how to utilize those content connectors more in depth. And we've mentioned several times that power of that collaboration and communication, and those being the key to success in our classrooms, whether virtual or in person. And we know that collaboration is one of the Council for Exceptional Children's high leverage practices as well. So we're going to give you some tools to help think about collaboration. We'll supply that resource list for you to start to think about as well. So the first resource we want to walk you through today is a template to begin that planning process, both your internal planning as well as your planning with paraprofessionals and general educators. So we know it is essential that we are sharing the content connectors with our paraprofessionals, with our parents, and having those conversations with parents to help them understand the importance of high expectations in alignment to the content connectors, as well as that partnership with Gen Ed so that we can be as aligned as possible to the general education curriculum and classroom. So this is a brainstorming template to get you to think about that process and how you're going to start to prepare to share the content connector resources. So a few considerations on this page. The first thing you're going to see are the content connector resources and the direct links to them. So no matter which resource you prefer, we want you to be able to reflect on how you could use it. So the first question is, how are you going to utilize that resource in your classroom? Whether it's the vertical alignment or that alignment to the Indiana academic standards, we want you to start to think through which is most beneficial to you and then which could be most beneficial to your colleagues. And being able to think through what a paraprofessional might like it as you show them those resources. And then thinking through how you're going to specifically share those resources with paraprofessionals and have a game plan. And we're going to start thinking about short and long-term goals in just a minute, but we want you to start to already be thinking about how you can share these resources, both with paraprofessionals, parents, and general educators. So that link should get you started with a self-reflection and then thinking beyond yourself and how you're going to start to share those resources. One of the biggest pieces that we discuss is that exposure versus mastery. In summary, we want to make sure that we're including students with significant disabilities in the general education setting and aligned to the curriculum as much as possible and having those high expectations for them. But we understand that that's not the same as having the same expectations for them as their non-disabled peers. So the way we address this is we start to think about mastery versus exposure. And this may be a way that you're going to discuss it with general educators or paraprofessionals. We know that students have the right to be exposed to grade level general education content aligned to their curriculum and aligned to their resources, but we also know that they need to be working on mastery at or near their ability level. So that balance between the exposure versus mastery is one way that we start to talk about implementing the content connectors and that alignment piece. The next thing that we think about is that meaningful access. And so this next slide here will have you starting to think about what those expectations are in the general education classroom and what some potential modifications might be. And this could be a really great resource to walk through with your general education teacher because you're providing that right-hand column. So if the general education expectation is to select a topic, a potential modification may be selecting a topic from 3 options. More importantly, you are probably going to leverage core vocabulary and visuals with that. So you may want to even modify that further for those students who we know need visuals and simple core vocabulary to access language. The second example, identifying similarities and differences, really focusing on those core vocabulary words of same or different. It may be pointing to those. It may be gesturing towards those. But we're keeping it around, again, aligned to the same objective, but aligned then modified towards that student's level. So there's some additional examples here, and I want to go on ahead and flip to the next slide because one of my favorite is really thinking about that first one. So writing an unfamiliar word in a vocabulary journal, something we're seeing in the brick and mortar schools more often, seeing it in the virtual space as we're utilizing apps to write those unfamiliar vocabulary words. But for a potential modification, it may be selecting an unknown word paired with a picture symbol and either cutting it out and gluing it in the journal, or if you're interacting with a Google slide, you're sliding that over so that you're seeing that interaction. So we're breaking it down. We're keeping the expectations still aligned to the same learning objective, but we're making sure that we're meeting that individual student's need. And they're working alongside their peers parallel and aligned. Another thing to think about as we're we're working through this process is that lesson plan template. So it's going to visit us here again, and there's two versions of this lesson plan template. One is the version for distance learning. So there it highlights those specific elements of distance learning, it pulls in those elements, but the original lesson plan has several of those key elements that you need as well. So it starts with that learning objective. It includes both the Indiana academic standards and the content connector. And then you start to break down that standard for emerging learners who are tier 1 learners who need those visuals and pictures, that simplistic language for every element that they are working towards, all the way to those students who are working at that applied level. And those are the students that are working close to that content connector. They're right there. So this lesson plan template will walk you through that process and give you some freedom to start to unpack and utilize universal design for learning just naturally as your planning process. I'm going to go ahead and show you just a couple more slides before we wrap up today, and I thank all of you for joining, and we'll hang on the line at 4:30 so that you can continue to ask questions. But I think it's so important when we talk about the content connectors. You're going to hear and see terms and verbs within the content connectors that are very specific. For example, you might see the term write or tell within the content connector. It's so important to think about the variation and the representation that that might mean as you're teaching the content connector, but also what does that look like for the student in their representation. So the word tell, for example, for one variation, it might be a student pointing to a picture. They might not tell using their voice. For another student, it might be they're responding with one or two words. We mentioned core and academic vocabulary. They may also point to that picture. And for another student, tell is responding using 1 to 2 sentences, and maybe even writing a simple sentence. So it's so important when we're using the word write or tell or state that we're aligning that to where that student is, and we're meeting them where they're at and allowing them to show what they know in different ways. And this next slide is just an example of that. So we have a main topic or skill. The representation from the teacher is we may be able to show that through a video. We may be able to show that through a comic strip or hands-on activity or a variation of all 3 of those instructional methods. But it's very important to not get caught up in the traditional methods, to think outside of the box, to give ourselves some permission to provide the representation, showing students the information and allowing them to show it back to us, their expression, in the mode that meets their needs. So I always like to include just a visual like this to keep us reminding ourselves how we meet individual student needs and giving ourselves permission to think creatively in our instruction. So the next piece is just a quick checklist. We like checklists around here at Project Success, and this is a great way to think about how you're collaborating with your general education teachers, and it can also be modified for your paraprofessionals as well. Thinking through the lesson plan template and walking through that, working towards the content connector resources and sharing that template, those different templates and those different tools and the way the content connectors are there. The unpacking template is an important piece because we're providing access in that way. So this is a checklist to get you walking through and give you that permission to start to sit down with your general education teachers and really have some strategic and important conversations around the content connectors and give you a how-to guide. So this will walk you through that process. If this is new to you, this checklist will help support you in this process. So Heidi just added it to the chat box as well. And then last but not least, we have presented a lot of information today around the content connectors, around collaboration, and those high leverage practices as well. So we always think it's a very valuable practice to sit down and write out some short and long-term goals around the topics that we discuss, and more specifically on how we can support students in the process. So this is a template to help you start to think about the implementation of the content connectors can feel extremely overwhelming. So taking 1 or 2 short-term goals that you can start on tomorrow, and then longer term goals that you're going to work towards throughout the school year is really important. And it gives you permission to space out the time and practice a lot of this content in implementation over the course of this next semester. So I'm going to just skip down to the recap of the who, what, and where of the content connectors, just so that we can wrap up today and then answer any questions that you may have. So we know that the content connectors are for those students with significant intellectual disabilities. We know they're called Indiana's alternate achievement standards. We know we use them in lesson planning, instruction, IEP goals, the IM assessment, as I joked, for all the things. We know that they're used in the least restrictive environment for that student, general education, special education, or a combination of both. And we know we use them because high expectations are called on. We know that high expectations lead to outcomes for all students, and especially those with significant intellectual disabilities. And how we do it is we balance and we prioritize and we infuse it into our current lessons and activities. And you don't have to do this alone. As you're thinking through that goal setting process, we want you to reach out to the project success team. We have several other opportunities to join us. We have an inclusive mindset opportunity for sharing the message. We have best practices for inclusive instruction. Both of those opportunities you can register for. That's just an expansion of our 3-part series over the summer if you joined us then. But if not, please join us and continue these important conversations. And join us on our website as well. So you can find all of our information, our educator tools, our administrator tools on our website. So the 2 most important elements on the website, the tabs that are most important to you, are the resource tab and the events tab. So resources take you there to those important resources like the content connectors, the unpacking tool, the IEP resources, as you start to think about that process, as well as the events. Is any time that we're meeting, any upcoming opportunity with the project success team, that information is there. So we will hang on just a couple minutes. We have our email addresses there on the screen, so you can always reach out to us that way, or connect with us on Twitter or Facebook, and follow along that way. But we will hang out. We'll monitor for about 5 more minutes. We'll monitor the chat box. You can unmute yourself if you have questions for the team, and we'll continue to share out through Twitter and Facebook and our website. And if not, thank you for all you're doing for Indiana students. I know this time is challenging, and thank you for doing what you're doing. And if you need us, our email is right there on the screen.